Welcome to Mandy the ABA and Aditi the OT's podcast.
We are two women across two time zones, from two cultures, two allied health fields, offering two very different perspectives.
Yet with a common goal of breaking down barriers and creating breakthroughs to promote interprofessional collaboration. Hello everybody, this is our 5th episode, oh my goodness, sleeping issues. So we are going to unravel the sensory behavioral perspectives related to sleep in infants. So hopefully everyone is excited, OTs, ABAs, OTAs, RBTs, and I think we even have an SLP who recently reached out to us. So very exciting. This episode, we will demonstrate another sharp contrast between the ABA and OT perspective and intervention, and yet again, find a way to come together and collaborate, because there's always a way. So last week we covered early beginnings and examined the case study of 9-month-old baby Stella and proposed some behavioral and OT-based interventions to address developmental delays. Today we're going to continue to look into how humans develop from birth and cover the topic of sleeping challenges, something very close to every parent's heart.
Good, and this week's shout out goes to one of my favourite people on the planet, Dr. Patrick Fryman. He is Vice President of Outpatient Behavioural Health Services and a clinical professor in the Department of Paediatrics at the University of Nebraska School of Medicine, amongst lots of other things. I hope I got that right, but he is a massive contributor to the field, both in paediatrics and in behaviour analysis. He has published over 180 scientific articles. I'm sure that number has changed since we even looked at the last data on his publishings, and 3 books, and he's the director of Boys Town. He's published on everything from how to get people to put rubbish in a bin more frequently to sleep interventions for toddlers and infants. He's dedicated his life to the application of behavioural science to fields of behavioural paediatrics and behavioural medicine. His knowledge and work in the field of autism and parent training is extensive. And if you want to give a public presentation of any sort, you better go and read his 15-step tutorial on public speaking. Absolutely brilliant. Dr. Friman is one of my favourite public speakers. To me, he's the behaviour analytic equivalent of Jim Carrey, but without the crazy, right? That's probably really understating the extent of his humour and his amazing speaking talents. But while he's published over 180 papers, one of his best-known interventions outside of behaviour analysis has been in the area of sleep challenges, and in particular an intervention referred to as the Bedtime Pass, which we are going to be presenting on in the next episode, and excitingly offering our first deeper dive for those that want to learn how to use that intervention successfully.
Oh my gosh, that's brilliant. So I saw him at a conference. I actually saw him speak. Oh my gosh, you are not kidding. He certainly is the Jim Carrey, a very smart version, I'm assuming. Smarter than Jim Carrey, although I've heard Jim Carrey's pretty smart too. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. And the Bedtime Pass is brilliant. I have read the research and I think OTs will love it, as will just parents. Okay, so back to this episode though, we are going to just chat a little bit about the takeaways. We have 2 lovely resources for you. Of course, we always have research articles that are pertaining to the latest topic, but we have 2 sleep tools. One is by Greg Hanley, who is a behavior analyst, and the assessment is called the SATT, Sleep Assessment and Treatment Tool. And then the Brief Infant Sleep Questionnaire, BISC, which was originally created by Dr. Avi Sadeh, and is avidly used in the world of pediatrics and in OT. So 2 great doctors, Dr. Greg Hanley and Dr. Avi Sadeh. All right, Mandy, you have never had sleep issues with your children, right? They were always perfect angels, I'm sure.
Aditi, I had sleep issues because I had 2 children before I came to the field of behaviour analysis and learnt a lot more about sleeping. But I feel like there was an entire decade of my life where I was totally sleep deprived. And yeah, really, it's only when I started to work in sleep interventions for children that I was working with in the field of behaviour analysis where I learnt a lot more about sleep. And when I finally taught my daughter with autism to sleep and stay in bed, it really changed my life. I mean, in profound ways. It allowed me to get out and see friends again, to start engaging in exercise again. It changed my outlook on life, my ability to work effectively. Obviously, sleep is one of the most important behaviours that we engage in. And if you are being constantly woken at night, it is just like someone is, stabbing you over and over again. It is, well, they use sleep deprivation as a form of torture, right? And that's exactly what it is. There were times in my daughter with autism's life where she didn't sleep more than an hour. And I remember, this is how desperate I got, because you do get pretty desperate when you are sleep deprived. The only way I could get any extended sleep, this is when she was quite a young child, is I had this really amazing bucket that she would sit up in. And she would be very happy sitting in the shower, with the water and her toys. And she was safe because I was sort of sitting, sleeping right next to her. And I would lay down a towel in the shower and I would actually sleep in the shower for short periods of time. So I got very desperate because she'd never sleep in the day, and then she would fall asleep and it would be hard for her to fall asleep. And then she would wake after an hour, and it was just debilitating. I was trying to do a lot of intervention with her, and so the only time I got where she to update materials and look at read and research was when she was asleep. So yeah, it is a really challenging area, and it's one of my real areas of passion. So thank goodness now I have a lot more tools and research at my fingertips, and I really love to work with parents on sleep intervention.
Gosh, so I was going to ask you what type of things you tried, car ride, swaddling, but you tried the shower. That's a new one for me.
Yeah, so that was, after my daughter was diagnosed with autism. But before that, with my first daughter, who's 3.5 years older, I tried almost everything. She also was a poor sleeper. Now knowing what I know, I was contributing to that fact by not teaching her how to go to sleep on her own. But back then I tried, creating bedtime routines, very set things to do before we went to bed to induce sleep and create melatonin production. I tried, swaddling. I had one of those slings, and I would get her to fall asleep in the sling and then gently, take it off from around my neck and lay it down on the bed. I became quite famous in our neighborhood because I was that crazy parent that was like, had my baby in a sling. I was walking around the neighborhood late at night and everybody knew me. I was the crazy sling lady. I lost 12 kilos with my first daughter because I had her if anybody wants to lose weight and you have a baby, put her in a sling and walk. I tell you, it's so good. So I tried, as everything I could, warm baths, aromatherapy oils, you name it, trying to create an environment that would induce sleep and keep my kids asleep. So I tried it all.
Well, so it's interesting because, there's such a cultural component to this. We as parents aren't taught how to get a baby to sleep. Like, that's not something that you sort of chat about. I think everyone assumes it's this sort of Johnson & Johnson moment and it just happens. You see the baby just sleeping, right? But it's based a lot on modeling and parental values. So, I'm Indian and very codependent sleeping culturally in our values. Basically, everything revolves around that baby and you do everything to get them to sleep, and it's all about doing it for them for the most part. So most people tend to try strategies that, their parents, grandparents used, knowledge that's passed down from generations, rocking, swaddling. Those are, very typical things. We do try to do it all. And most of it, for typical kids, most of it works, right? It's pretty reinforcing because when it works, then you do more of it. And obviously it's reinforcing because both the parent and the child get restful night of sleep. However, what happens when those strategies don't work, right? That your mum taught you or that you saw your aunt doing. So it's funny, my dad, when I first did the Ferber method with my son, he was horrified. He was like, that's not the right way to take care of your baby, because he had the idea culturally, of the Indian way, which is basically you hold your baby all night. But then when I got my first son to start sleeping by himself, after that, anyone who would talk to him about a baby not sleeping, he'd send them to me. Like, go talk to her. She knows how to do it. So, the Ferber method worked like a charm for my first one.
Yes. I mean, and I in the early days when before my second daughter came along, I was in a yoga support group that I had. Actually, he had lived a lot of his life in India. He was a yoga guru, and he was very much about co-sleeping as well. And I did that with both of my children. I co-slept with them and, self-soothed them back to bed at night because of that, all of that kind of belief and understanding of attachment in early days. And I really thought that having close proximity. But I tell you what, the downside to that is I was very tired because I was very aware of my child's movements. And it created a very light sleeping in me. And even to this day, I think I'm still a very light sleeper as a result of being very attuned to noise in the environment. So, yeah, you're right. There is a big cultural aspect. And I know I'm working with one Indian family right now. And, most of their community have their children up with them very late at night as well. So that brings another perspective to sleeping too, having children go to bed at different times, etc. So, yeah, it's definitely challenging.
Oh, gosh, yeah. And, I just remember after I got my first one to sleep through the night using Ferber and all that, I thought I was such a, arrogance about it. I was like, I got this, right? And then, of course, my second one comes along and the crying never stopped.
Yeah, he didn't read the Ferber book.
I should have put him in the shower like you suggested.
Yeah, that is not my recommendation for anyone, by the way, just off the cuff. That is not a preferred intervention, yeah.
So he just cried all the time.
Yeah.
And I remember we would take him for car rides. That was our go-to.
Oh, yeah, that is very common. Yeah.
And then I did find out one night, I happened to be taking a shower, had the dryer on, and that calmed him and got him to sleep. I thought, oh my gosh, I found something. But of course I couldn't leave the dryer on all night.
Yeah.
So then I tried the vacuum, and then I ended up actually finding a CD that had a recording of dryer or vacuum. I can't remember what it was. And I just played it on repeat all night. And it did the trick, but it was so interesting because it would, play the vacuum noise, and then, when it would repeat, there'd be like a little pause, a tiny pause. And in that tiny pause, I would hear him stirring.
Wow.
I'm like, you can't be serious, So anyway, I just knew that it, wasn't going to be a long-term issue, something I'd have to address. And I can tell you as an OT, we have a plethora of clients who come to us with similar issues. Mm-hmm. But sleep is so complex. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
That's right.
So what is your thought on sleep?
Yeah, that's a summary of all the things I tried. So let's look at what medicine says then is normal sleep patterns, because going back to when I had children, I didn't have, any data on how frequently they were sleeping, how long they were sleeping for, whether that was normal or not. But some studies have suggested that babies sleep an average of 16 hours in 24-hour period. And it's reported that between 20 and 30% of children experience sleep problems, and between, you said later on, Aditi, 40 to 80% of children with developmental disabilities have sleep disorders. That's not even just sleep challenges, but sleep disorders, which sort of meet a certain criteria in terms of how long it takes them to go to sleep and how long they stay asleep for. So there is absolutely no doubt that this is a significant problem. So what does medicine say about what causes a human to fall asleep, Aditi, or at least how do OTs view sleep?
Well, the anatomy of sleep requires various structures in the body sort of work in synchronicity, right, to develop those circadian rhythms involving sleep and wake cycles. But generally what happens, very simplistically here, is the brainstem acts to reduce the activity of the arousal centers in our brain, and then relaxes the muscles so that we can go to sleep. And the pineal gland is what increases the production of melatonin, which many people take over the counter, which actually helps you to sleep when the lights go down. The thalamus is the part of the brain that becomes really quiet and lets you tune out, sort of filter away the external world. And then, of course, here's the S word again. Sensory modulation is the integral factor here. If we can't modulate the sensory information that's in our environment, it's going to be hard to go to sleep. So our ability to habituate and ignore irrelevant information like dripping faucet or ticking of a clock, all those aspects are going to interrupt sleep. And we need to do that, habituate to all that so that we can calm the nervous system, which is the key. So if we think about all the antics we do as parents to get our children to sleep, in reality, what we're doing is trying to help the body biologically get there, right? By shutting out all this sensory information, exposure to light, sounds, all that, while enhancing more of those rhythmical sensory input like rocking, swaddling, doing all those activities in hopes of getting this biological process set in motion.
Okay. So before all my behaviour analytic friends hear that S word and start reaching for their own pause button, let's start by hearing an OT's perspective on sleep, and then I'll outline a behavioural account on sleep, of which there is, a lot of research and data. You go ahead first, Aditi, and I promise not to use the pause button.
Okay. Well, sleep for OTs really starts in the neonatal unit. I think that's the earliest that we start working on sleep because it's all about neuroprotective care in the NICU and preserving sleep. That's our main goal. And in OT, sleep is conceptualized more as a restorative occupation, so to speak, with the goal of rest and recuperation of the body. So obviously, when we work with clients from various backgrounds and diseases, diagnoses, sleep is hugely what we call an instrumental ADL. So in developing children, sleep serves multiple factors or functions: energy conservation, brain growth, memory consolidation, and obviously impacts cognition. So it's a very, very precious commodity for many of our clients, especially with ASD. And research indicates that insufficient sleep actually exacerbates the severity of core ASD symptoms, the repetitive behaviors we might see, maladaptive behaviors, aggression, etc. So it tends to be one of the most burdensome complaints amongst parents of children with autism because obviously it's impacting everybody. It's not just the child, right? And as you mentioned earlier, it's just pure torture.
Yeah.
Main issues we address are difficulty falling asleep, frequent wakings, shorter sleep, restlessness, etc.
That's right. And then, you add the parent's perspective that when you're dealing with autism, they also have to get those kids off to therapy many times and being sleep deprived themselves and then dealing with sleep deprived children. That brings, a huge challenge. So I guess it's just one little disclaimer I wanted to throw in there that, I'm sure everybody listening to this is aware that there are often medical underpinnings as well as, behavioural complexities to sleep, and that having, medical sign-off is always a prerequisite to me working with any clients that have sleep issues. So the use of some of the procedures that I talk about later on in this podcast is always subject to medical sign-off to commence that process. So let's talk about then, behavioural accounts of sleeping behaviour, because from our last episode, you remember we looked at both, respondent and operant learning, and potentially there are respondent and operant components of sleep. It's not, in other words, if sleeping was easy, everybody would do it. If it's something that was like blinking when you got water sprayed in your eyes, if it was like respondent behavior, then we wouldn't be needing to talk about sleep today. But it's complex because it isn't just one thing that has to happen in order to elicit sleep. So it's not purely respondent behavior from a behaviour analyst point of view. In other words, it's not unlearned behavior. It has to be, there's a learning component to it. There's no one unconditioned stimulus that elicits sleep, like, as I said, a puff of air in the eye elicits a blink, or dust up the nose elicits a sneeze. That's not what sleeping is. Perhaps the behaviour of falling asleep is reinforced by sleep. In other words, what happens before sleep from a behaviour analyst results in sleep, and that component of sleeping is partly operant, and that the falling asleep is the end of a chain of behaviour that starts with bedtime preparation and then a period of quiet or quietude is what behaviour analysts like to refer to it as, that results in sleep. So perhaps the behaviour of falling asleep from a behaviour analyst perspective is that behaviour is reinforced by the sleep itself, and therefore the component of sleeping is operant or learned, that component. So falling asleep is the kind of the end of a chain of behaviour, starting with bedtime preparation, and then a period of quietude that results in sleep. So similar to hunger, or what a behaviouralist likes to call, because we're technical, deprivation of food by the environment, resulting in a person engaging in behaviour to get food and thereby reducing their hunger or that feeling of being deprived of calories, and then reinforcing those behaviours that resulted in that state. Because if you've ever seen anyone that's really hungry, you'll see them quite madly searching cupboards, opening and closing fridges. That results in that feeling of hunger dissipating. And sleep deprivation is one of those experiences for the human body because it is unpleasant. And so presumably behaviour that results in reducing that unpleasant state is reinforced. So the period of time since sleep was last obtained makes sleep more valuable as a reinforcer, is what a behaviouralist would say. In other words, the longer we go without sleep, the more we need to and want to sleep.
Wow. So, interesting perspective, because does that mean you see sleep as more of a voluntary choice or something that can be controlled regardless of bodily functions? Because, OTs tend to see it more as a sort of a mixed bag, right? A combination of intrinsic and extrinsic learned factors.
Great. Actually, Aditi, I'm really glad you brought up choice and volition, because this is something that you have, recounted about an OT's perspective on lots of different behaviours. So I'm really excited that I do want to bring that perspective on choice. It's definitely an area where behaviouralists brings a long history of research on how people choose what they do at any point in time, because all of us make these, in inverted commas, air inverted commas, choices, all day, every day. And I really want to go into that from a behaviouralist perspective, because we look at that quite differently, I think, to an OT perspective. We look at like schedules of reinforcement and something called the matching law. So if you don't mind me just pausing, using a pause button there on volition and choice, if you can just hold that thought and don't get too judgy through this episode, I promise we'll come back to that and find a common way to talk about volition and choice. Is that okay?
Oh, brilliant. Sounds
Great.
Good.
So I'm just going back a step there. So from a behaviouralist perspective, each one of the behavioural steps in a sleep chain, I'm just creating that term for myself, but a chain of behaviour that becomes, something that then becomes embedded behaviour or habitual, from our perspective, it needs to come under the control of a reliable precursor. That's what we call an SD or a discriminative stimuli, something that reliably precedes a behaviour that then is reinforced. And that can be either outside or within the skin. And it's why, though, there is a lot of research in creating consistent sleep routines. When I say there is, I could say perhaps there is, about creating sleep routines, because what is the consequence for one behaviour in a sleep chain is the antecedent to the next step. So, I'm sure you went through that with your children as well, Aditi, is trying to create predictable and consistent sleep routines. So, having dinner at the same time at night and then brushing teeth and then putting on pajamas, and some parents will use massage or music. And if the end result of that is that sleep results, that whole chain of behaviour could condition up as one big behavioural chain. And that's how a behaviouralist looks at sleeping, quite a complex series of behaviour that results in the body being asleep.
So, if I think about, there must be a huge cultural variance then, because that behavioral chain or routine, there's so many cultures who just don't do that.
Yes. Yeah. And
right?
I agree with that. I just actually was at a pediatrician's office a family of mine that's Indian, and he was talking about the differential in sleep across culture, and I lived in Spain for a year as well, where, kids are awake often till like 11 and 12 o'clock at night frequently. And it's, you can go down to the park at midnight and there's kids running around. So, it's true. There is a real cultural difference, and I haven't looked into the research on how that impacts learning and behaviour, etc. But, for instance, in Spain, they have an afternoon siesta whereby the kids rest and get sleep. So it'd be interesting to look at, the number of hours across cultures that children are getting. And what if that has any long-term, consequence or learning outcomes or something? But there you go. That's maybe a topic for another day. But you're right. Big cultural difference in sleep routines.
Okay, but going back to children with special needs and specifically ASD, I did see several studies that have hypothesized that sleep disturbances are often associated with or even caused by sensory sensitivities in ASD clients. So researchers have discovered there's a huge link, significant link between sleep behaviors, patterns, and the way the body experiences sensory stimuli or sensations. So this particular research paper found that children who were hypersensitive, so oversensitive to touch, sensitive to light, movement, they had a harder time falling asleep. So ABA therapists are probably like, what on earth is that about, right?
Well, I mean, I think, there's no doubt that when you're dealing with a child that has a diagnosis of autism, I want to make it absolutely clear that behaviouralists would, I don't think, at least any that I've worked with, would never argue that children with autism tend to, respond to stimuli in unusual ways and different ways from typical developing children. So, it's not unusual to see children with autism having their hands over their ears, for instance, to shelter out noise, or, to avoid certain stimuli that other children might really enjoy engaging with. But I don't think it's as simple as just saying it's just purely sensory, because frequently, I'll give you one example of a child that presented to me whose parents said that they had a real sensitivity to noise. When I did my functional assessment, I discovered that this child didn't like going to assembly. And when he was put in assembly and put his hands over his ears, they would take him outside. So he became quite fluent at using that behaviour, right? It was reinforced by removal from an environment that he did not like. So, there's, of course, there's a social aspect to that as well, because without any judgment at all, there's a lot of children with autism that don't mind putting their hands over their ears and look different, right? But if you said to a typical developing kid, hey, you look a little unusual when you put your hands over their ears, that is going to shape their behaviour going forward. So there is, that sensory complexity, there is a behavioural component to all of that. For instance, we have in our clinic, we have a bell that we ring when, I know you have something similar, Aditi, when kids pass programs. It's really loud. I mean, it's a ship bell. It literally was designed for a ship. So when kids with autism come to our clinic, a lot of them will put their hands over their ears when they first hear that. But then we anticipate when that's going to happen, right? And we go, hey, listen up, the bell is going to ring. Can you keep your hands strong for me? And guess what? They don't put their hands over their ears anymore because we shape and reinforce, tolerating that noise. So there is, of course, it's complex, but there is no doubt that many kids with autism present to me with heightened sensitivity to noise, different sensory experience through food. So I never want to deny that we don't look at that component. We absolutely do. But I think you have to be careful there too, not just to say it's only sensory, because as soon as you start reinforcing any behaviour that might be blocking stimuli, either seeking or blocking sensory stimuli, you add a behavioural component as well. So that's what I want to add to that. But in terms of sleep, the same thing can occur, right? So, when we come back to looking at our views on these topics that we present, I feel like we get to the same outcome, but often, using different terms or different explanations for how they occur. In relation to sleep, I think I just maybe could describe this as like the chicken and egg argument. So, for instance, from a behaviouralist perspective, sure, let's just say you have a child that has autism that is more sensitive to noise, and perhaps that could be a whole nother area of topic, Aditi, on habituation and how habituation comes about. It's desensitization, I guess, to stimuli that we're all exposed to, and whether, how autism impacts your ability to habituate. But then don't forget, as I can say this as a parent as well of a child with autism, parents with children with autism, some of us more sensitive to noise as well, because sometimes I used to go over to friends' houses and their kids would be crying or, falling asleep and having a bit of a cry and stuff. And I'd be like, oh, is he okay? And they'd be like, oh, it's fine. No worries. And, meanwhile, there's other kids coming in and out of the room and I'm like, shh, you might wake the baby. And the kids are like, what? Nah, it's lucky he'll fall asleep. But as parents of children with autism, very frequently those noises that our children make, particular noises as well, may be precursor behaviours to more serious behaviour as well. So, I remember the noise my daughter used to make before she would jump to her knees, something embedded in my brain forever. So, there's a complexity there too, that parents with children with autism are going to be highly sensitized to noise as well, and therefore possibly, I'm not saying they all do this, but attend to that noise with either, going into the room, comforting, providing something that may reinforce that noise and then attention provided to that, or escape from, or maybe picking them up and taking them out of the bedroom. So this is why sleep is so complex, and why, these very detailed questionnaires on looking at parent behaviour around their children's behaviour have been developed as well. So, and then we go back to this issue of, infant sleep, early baby sleep, Aditi, and in babies, the REM and the non-REM cycles are quicker. And as such, REM sleep is preceded by periods of arousal where it's more likely they will wake. And just going back on what I said then, if it makes them more vulnerable to waking and having awake durations, if that can also be accompanied by crying, it's more likely that parent interaction can come about through those nighttime wakings. So, how it's frequent for parents to say, actually, this is not your experience and not my experience, but at least in some of the parents I came by, is that as time went on through their third or even fourth child, the fourth child learned to sleep, better. And, one could hypothesize that perhaps it was because they were not as attentive. They were so busy and attending to other children, etc., that children were able to, there was no reinforcement provided to those sort of early unhappiness periods during sleep arousals, and then they were sort of went back to sleep on their own. So, if learning to fall asleep, which I think there is, behavioural research on this, requires periods of quietude, and those periods are interrupted, it's possible that there is this behavioural component to waking, right? That's kind of the issue that I want to bring up.
Well, I'm glad you did, because I would say that OTs agree to all of the above. And when we look at a child for sleep issues, we look at their occupational profile, we look at the parent profile, parent values. And I can tell you, coming from an Indian culture, often extended family culture, where it's loud and nobody cares that it's loud.
Right.
And here, when I came to the US, it was so stringent, bedtime is 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock and everyone has to be quiet and all that. And I just found it really interesting. And I've worked with so many students in the past who've had sensory issues and sleep difficulties. And I had an interesting case where this little boy, he could not sleep unless it was loud. He needed that conundrum. And then when we looked into it, he was from a different culture and he was in an extended family household. And it was lots of people, very loud. And they moved to this country and mum was like, you can't sleep. And I remember we would try different, typically we try lullabies and sounds and all that. Nothing worked. And then one day we put just some random loud, crazy song. I don't even know what it was. And he loved it. And then the worse it got as far as it tones and frequencies, the more he enjoyed it. And we recorded cafeteria sounds, being in a cafeteria. He loved that. It was the most bizarre thing, but that just helped him sleep. So I absolutely agree that the environment and how you're trained how you are habituated makes a huge difference. So I'm glad we agree on something.
Yeah, I feel like it's a behavioural account of sleep right there.
Right.
Because when you took her out, the consequences for that, chain of sleep, when you took those out, he couldn't sleep. It is actually, reinforces behavioural link perspective. So, yeah, we're on the same page there, Aditi. Great.
Woohoo! So, okay, going back to ASD, I imagine you guys work on sleep a lot too, correct?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of published research in this area. I guess if you look at, what the ultimate goal is of behaviour analysis, it is to improve socially meaningful behaviours. And I can't think of anything, the behaviours of sleeping, eating, toileting. They're 3 prerequisite behaviours really that behaviour analysts want to ensure are in place to make sure that a child can, maximise their potential, for want of a better word, but, be the best human being they can be, because without adequate diet, without adequate sleep, and not being able to toilet yourself, life can be pretty challenging for yourself and your caregivers. So we absolutely do that. And of course, let's go back to an earlier episode there, sleep is something a dead man can't do. So therefore it is behaviour and very important to health. And as you said earlier, Aditi, cognitive functioning, and there is a lot of research to support, its implication to challenging behaviour in children with autism, not to mention parental stress levels, amongst other things. And I can remember, I don't know if there's any research on this, but I don't know what the divorce rates are around sleeping disorders, but they've got to be high because, there is nothing more challenging as a mother having got your baby to sleep and then dad comes home, la, 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 banging, crashing, slamming doors, and the baby wakes. That is a recipe for divorce right there, particularly if you are sleep deprived and, have, extended period of time with the child. So, I don't know what the research is on that, but definitely parental stress levels around sleep can be very, very high. Her causal links have been shown, though, between poor sleep habits and learning difficulties. So, therefore, it's a very important area of us to work on to ensure that sleep is in place. So we can eliminate that as a cause of learning difficulties. If we briefly return to concepts that we raised in episode 4, reflexive behaviour, respondent conditioning and operant conditioning, then those things sort of all come together to make sleep a series of complex, behavioural units, if you want to describe it as that, some of which is unlearned, like I said, the REM, non-REM sleep components, and then stimuli conditioned around sleep, such as feeding and putting on pajamas, playing music, or loud noise in the example that you gave. So that's, what we would call these kind of conditioned stimuli evoking sleep. And then it gets more complex because if the infant is then comforted when it's crying or fussing, then the possibility of reinforcing bedtime refusal or extending the time it takes to get to sleep. And then, disturbing that process of what we call that quietude process of a child learning to fall back asleep by themselves can be reinforced by, a parent comforting the child in the presence of learning that behaviour. So, that's a long way of saying, yes, there's a lot to be involved in there as a behaviour analyst because there's a lot of behaviour.
Wow. So really, behaviour is in every little component of sleep. So I think I can't emphasize this enough to my fellow OTs out there. If you are addressing sleep and looking at sensory aspects, you really have to consider the manifestation of behavioral consequences. It just sounds like it's a really fine line there. So OTs definitely, have started thinking about behavior. But do ABA therapists think about sensory, strategies and all that when they're considering sleep?
Yeah, I guess, Aditi, it's that word sensory that we need to keep translating into behaviour analytic terms because absolutely there, if we look at sleep studies and the different sleep problems that have been identified, in inverted commas, I want to say that sensory component, of course gets looked at because, if you're at any intervention, there is going to be a component of touch or smell or sight or, in this case, sound that impacts someone's ability to learn anything. So definitely that sensory input. Maybe one day I'll be able to use that word without, being uneasy about it for my behavioural friends out there. So, it might be a good way of starting to look at, what are the types of sleep problems that we see and that have been recognised in the literature, that have been diagnosed, because studies have been designed specifically to address the different types of sleep problems, and from a behaviouralist perspective, based on the function of that sleep problem. So sleep problems can be sleep onset delay, which we all know about, kids not wanting to go to sleep or refusing to go to sleep. Then nighttime waking, so, frequent arousal during the night. And then often the one us parents hate so much, which is early morning waking, or a combination of, those three. And they have been looked at separately in the behavioural literature. When you add in a bedtime resistance that can come about by, on sleep onset delay, and then potentially you have a complex combination of both, biological, circadian, and like neurodevelopmental factors as well that are influenced, but not solely attributable to environmental and behavioural variables. Stole that from a STEAM study because I thought it was such a good description of what was occurring. Some of those you could easily identify as sensory. So behaviouralists assess the contributing factors that are determining each of those sleep problems using a number of different assessments, including the behavioural evaluation of disorders of sleep. There's another one conveniently called BEDS, which I think stands for Behavioural Evaluation of Disorders of Sleep. Well, that's BEDS, sorry. Let me go back. That's BEDS. I like that abbreviation there. And then the tool that I've most frequently used is Dr. Greg Hanley's tool, which is a sleep assessment and treatment tool, which we have as a resource in this episode. So it's important then to look at trying to break down, what is the sleep problem, and then secondly, what are the contributing factors to that problem?
Okay, so in a nutshell, the sensory aspects definitely can exacerbate the behavioral aspects of sleep.
Yes, and vice versa, I guess. Yes.
So quite a convoluted mess of learned and unlearned behaviors. Mm-hmm. If a child neurophysiologically struggles to fall asleep, that would be more unlearned. I can see how, and that's where often we, say it's sensory. I can see how caregivers' responses to that, or even an OT suggestion of do this or do that, could reinforce those inappropriate learned behaviors. Or am I just oversimplifying it too much here?
No, I think that is a really good summary, and I want to make sure that I'm not coming across as arrogant here and saying, gosh, behaviouralists get it all right and OTs don't know what they're doing. That is never my perspective, because constantly being opened up to, interventions and research that comes from OT, that is enlightening to me. So, but the way that you put it there, I think is right, Aditi. It's a sort of a chicken and egg thing. And this is where assessment is critical to, determine the function of the sleep problem and therefore recommendations for a sleep intervention.
Well, I think it also brings to fruition the whole point of an ABA and OT collaboration. I think this is where we need to collaborate.
I agree.
You might work with a client and do X, Y, and Z, and then I'd come and do, ABC, and then we're in trouble because... So I really, really think this is where we can really come together. So OTs also present a view of, he has difficulty regulating to fall asleep. And because of, XY sensory issues in their repertoire, and they can't help it. So I do think OTs have more of he can't help it. And therefore, I'm not sure if I want to implement these behavioral strategies because it seems harsh. So really finding that balance again would be key, and talking it through with an ABA therapist would be key.
Yes, because I think what you're kind of alluding to, Aditi, is that some of these interventions from behavioral analytic interventions of, for instance, controlled crying or what we call escape extinction for sleep might appear to some people as being a little harsh. And that's why I sort of put in there my precursor that we have to ensure that we're not dealing with any, underlying medical complications when we're dealing with sleep. But looking at the setting events surrounding sleep, such as diet and sleep hygiene, sleep routines, parent experiences, etc., are all, also, as you mentioned there, co-sleeping too, are all important factors in assisting parents with sleep issues, because while the interventions can be difficult to implement, I think the long-term outcome of sleeping problems, because my second daughter had these sleep issues, up to the age she was 8 before I really decided that I was ready to do some pretty serious intervention with her. And I was a single parent. So 8 years of disturbed sleep, a marriage breakdown, I won't say that sleep was the only reason for that, but definitely a contributing factor, without a doubt. These, and then long-term potentially learning difficulties, it is, something that needs to be addressed sometimes with a veracity that requires everybody to come together and to ensure that it can be done. So from our perspective, we would start with an intensive assessment, then look at baseline measures. Again, that's what we do. We would take, periods that it's taking to what the sleep onset delay is, the number of times that the child wakes. This is challenging data to take. I'm oversimplifying this. Yeah. And it requires, from my perspective at least, and from a behavioural perspective in general, that the behaviour under treatment comes under observation, which brings with it the complications that you need to observe a child sleeping or going to sleep. Sleep diaries are one way of doing that. But then you're going to be reliant on a parent that's already sleep deprived, accurately recording the information in amongst all the other chaos that's going on in the family, and then observing the child sleeping to determine if night waking is occurring. That also brings with it its own challenges, because you don't want to wake the child, by going in and observing. So now there are really good, of course, technology has come a long way now with, remote video cameras, and they have sleep sensors on them, so they determine when the child's waking. So it makes it a lot easier. You can record all night video footage and then later somebody can take data on it. But there are also sensors that you can get that a child can wear to assist in getting really good data to look at latency to fall asleep or time awake during the night. Studies such as the SATT, reported that playing with books, magazines and paper while in bed, interacting with siblings, engaging in motor and vocal stereotypy, there you go, there's that sensory component, listening to music, playing with electronic devices, repeatedly asking questions to parents, for verbal children, accessing food, intrusive noise and light, and physical comforting were all functional variables that had to be subsequently addressed through, multi-procedure interventions, including parent education. So, it's a summary of the things that are looked at through that assessment, and the summary of things were addressed during sleep time interventions. So what about OT as a sleep disorder? Aditi, do you look at those different distinctions of different types of sleep disorders?
Well, again, I think some of it is how we label things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Language again. So poor sleep can be an indicator of sensory processing difficulties in our world, and there are different subtypes of types of sensory disorders that impact sleep differently. Sometimes it might be the routine leading up to bedtime, which is dysregulated, or perhaps the child is so overstimulated from the day that they can't settle down to go to sleep. Other times they may not get enough stimulation and have been so understimulated that the body has been essentially asleep all day long. So all these variances can impact the quality of sleep too. As adults with typical neurology, we have the ability, and we do it somewhat, inadvertently, to regulate our sensory systems throughout the day, transitioning through periods of alertness, sluggishness, and we engage in activities to help us get there, like you might go and drink a glass of water or coffee, etc. And so we build these activities into our lives. But what happens is children who have sleep issues have a difficult time regulating. And they don't necessarily have access to these strategies, and that's where OTs come in and try to figure that out. So these children often depend on co-regulation, environmental strategies, and contrived sensory input to help them. But I just want to point out that these strategies are often just interim solutions. Our goal, too, is to get that child to sleep on their own. So I think we're, again, starting at different points and coming together.
Yeah. And Aditi, what about the sort of data you might keep in determining what the cause of the sleep problem is?
Oh, blast of data. You know what? We're always going to fall short of data collections. And again, this is one of the issues we have, is that we take a very great holistic view that contribute to sleep dysfunction, which includes sleep preparation, participation. We measure latency, like you mentioned, duration, maintenance, or drowsiness, etc. And we typically start with the sensory profile again, looking at those areas, and then we measure using the brief infant sleep questionnaire, and that tells us a little bit about nocturnal sleep duration, daytime sleep duration, sleep onset, etc., etc. So those are the tests we typically use, but again, they're more global tests and not in the moment tests.
No problems. And look, that is not about making anybody wrong, except that what's recounted to me many times in working with other professionals is that it didn't work. But when I asked them what didn't work or how long it had been used or what was the problem they were actually trying to treat, in other words, is this a bedtime resistance? Is this bedtime waking? That is what they weren't able to present. So I don't think you can say something is not working if you don't have data to support it. Now, if it has been trialed and, and data taken on it and the sleep is not improving, in fact, you have hours of sleep and the sleep is worsening or the number of nighttime wakings, then you can say it didn't work. But one risk is that it wasn't implemented consistently. There was no, written program to train a parent how to do it consistently. Data was not kept. And therefore, actually, you're making the problem worse without knowing it by, parents not following a prescription. And in some areas of life, that's kind of not important. If you're teaching a kid to play with a toy, not critical, but when it comes to sleep or eating, I think that's where we really can add something to the equation, and not in a making it wrong thing, but this is our science and our underpinnings, just like OT has a lot to contribute, I feel, to our world in terms of how to ensure children, are using their bodies well and engaging with the environment well and highly attentive and receptive to instruction. I really feel like the OT world has a lot to contribute there, looking at how is a child sitting in a chair, what's their core strength like to be able to sit and engage in therapy, what is their ability to reach for stimuli? And, those components of OT are very powerful to a behaviour analyst. I want to open that to the world of, behaviour analysts, what OT knows about how the body interacts with the environment. But when it comes to measurement and deciding whether something is working or not, we really know how to do that well. So that's a long way.
You do.
Yeah.
And I want to add there that if OT, one of our core tenets is to be holistic. And if we're truly going to be holistic, we need to look at sleep from the behavioral perspective and really understand it. So it's not just measure it. You need to make sure that you are looking at every angle, and collaborating with an ABA therapist allows us to do that very effectively.
Great.
Right?
Great. Listen to that. Listening, like not making anybody wrong about their own perspectives.
No.
But let's just say for now, there was something outside the OT or the behaviour analytic world that contributed to the clientele that I was working with. I want to know about it, and I'm just going to send a little shout out to that speechie that reached out to me that heard about our podcast. Thank you. I won't mention her by name because I don't have her consent, but she reminded me I have this one child that I'm really struggling with to get different voice sounds. And she reminded me of these amazing switches to match auditory sounds. And I had forgotten about all of that work that SLPs do in auditory matching, and I was so excited by that. So I think, opening yourself to outside fields, even though you might have different perspective on underpinnings, you often come up with really extraordinary strategies that really impact your interventions. So thank you for that listening, Aditi. I love that you we can laugh about this and joke about it, but that you really see that there's a contribution for behaviour analysis in the OT world, not in a making you wrong way, but guess what? There's something we know that can really impact your awesome work that you're already doing.
Yeah. Well, tell me about those interventions in sleep problems that ABAs do.
Yep, absolutely. So one procedure that has been used is a fated bedtime procedure. And again, this is coming down to assessment and assessing, okay, what are these parents able to do as well? What is the environment the child lives in, and what are they consistently going to be able to implement successfully? And Patrick Fryman's, intervention is a less harsh intervention than some of the, control crying interventions, and something that we'll look at next week. But one procedure is the fated bedtime procedure that's been successfully used in children with sleep onset problems. This is whereby you push back the bedtime from baseline measurement. So let's just say it's taking a child 30 minutes to get to sleep. They go to sleep at 8:30 every night. You might push back the bedtime to 9 o'clock or 9:30 and keep the child awake through any means possible for a longer period so they are more likely to go to sleep. And, from a behavioural perspective, it's a response cost because it's not very pleasant to be kept awake when you're starting to get tired. But this procedure has been used successfully in both typical children and children with ASD, with the effects of reducing delayed sleep onset and establishing improved sleep routines. So that's one procedure. I'll put a link to some of those studies in our resources. Other interventions have included positive bedtime routines, and I feel like this is very OT-friendly type interventions, but there's a lot of studies there too published with success. Being antecedents to creating that chain of behaviour and quietude that results in sleep being evoked, and often accompanied by social extinction, so removing attention for less preferred behaviours through the bedtime process. And then, as I mentioned before, the most well-known procedure outside of the behavioural field is Dr. Patrick Fryman's Bedtime Pass. That's a combination of social extinction and what we call differential reinforcement. And we'll be covering this intervention in a lot of detail next podcast, I should say, and how to train parents to conduct that intervention. And then, of course, there is just pure escape extinction, which is after assessment that there is no underlying medical condition, you're going to put a child to sleep, and there can be a variety of interventions as to how you respond to the child. You can let the child cry for a certain period of time before going in and extend that period of time before you go in and attend to the child, with the result that eventually the child will fall asleep. Or you can go cold turkey and decide we're going to let the child cry for a period of time until such time as they fall asleep on their own. And there is a variety of different interventions, again, based on assessment and sleep, the extent of the sleep problem, and the parent's ability to be able to put in place those types of interventions. What about, Aditi, OT interventions for sleep?
Well, I think you're probably familiar with most of them. There are lots of sort of cognitive strategies like social stories, sleep hygiene, sensory-based strategies, environmentally that we are adapting the environment for. Medical aspects, medication might be a component we work with the doctor with. So really, sensory-based strategies, we try to use the sort of 2 to 4 week trial before determining its effectiveness. Again, we could definitely use your help in pinpointing that, refining that. Maintaining a sleep journal and a log by parents or caregivers is often something we use. And then, of course, really doing a lot of accommodations in the environment. So reducing the stimuli, manipulating the environment, schedule of when sensory input is given. So there's a quote in the OT literature which I loved, and it's a good night's sleep begins in the morning, right? So if you look at our sensory system, we need X amount of input during the day to help us regulate to sleep. Again, these are very antecedent type behaviors that we want them to engage in. I'm sure you've heard of the sensory diet, which is basically, therapeutic use of sensory activities that are embedded in our daily routine. And as I mentioned before, you and I are doing this already. If you come home from work, what do? Some of us go take a long bath. Some of us eat popcorn and watch Netflix. It depends on what your thing is. So that's essentially what we do in the OT world. It gets really tricky when we don't consider timing, because that's where, if it becomes a consequence rather than an antecedent, with sleep, it's so tricky, that can really make a huge error in intervention. And there are major consequences for parents and for children. So that's where, I think us really talking about this and passing this is really important. So let's stay on the case of Stella, if we can go back to her and talk about it a little bit. She's 9 months old, a preemie, she was having difficulty with tolerating touch and being handled by mum. And she was displaying a delayed sleep onset, night waking, and unwarranted co-sleeping. So the parents tried having her cry it out, but, they didn't see much improvement in the sleep patterns, and she didn't stay asleep during the night. She woke up every 1 to 2 hours crying, and then parents would have to go to attend to her. So that's kind of the case study. And I'm just going to tell you how I would start, addressing this as an OT. I would talk to mom and ask her to log her activities for the day, what she does with Stella, what's that type of routines. And then I would also look at some client factors, parent values, co-sleeping, all those, what do you care about? That's going to be really important. What strategies have they tried? What worked? What didn't work? Since I know Stella was in the neonatal unit, I would confer with the therapist there to see what strategies might have worked. And are there any medical factors, reflux, medications, etc., right? Then once I have this information, I'd probably start with deep pressure as sort of the go-to in sensory world. It really organizes the body and helps regulation. So swaddling is something that I would do with, I would say to mom, let's do that prior to falling asleep. So mom would keep a diary for about 1 to 2 weeks to see how long it takes Stella to fall asleep, and then introduce the swaddling and see if that changes. And then we'd consider adding different sensory strategies, adding white noise, massage, all that. Now, I'm more interested to know what you would do, Mandy.
So I guess the first point there is we would run the SATT or a similar sleep intervention, again, to address, I don't want to go over too much of what you've said there, but we would get data on the amount of sleep by hours. So if this is a really serious sleep disorder, presumably parents are going to invest a fair amount of time and money in this intervention. So looking at getting proper equipment to measure sleep. I think sleep diaries, there is some research on matching sleep diaries to actual sleep. And studies came up with varying outcomes for that. Sometimes there was like a 70% accuracy, sometimes an 80% accuracy. But if you really have a significant problem here as behaviouralists, we want really accurate data to see if our interventions are impacting, the amount of sleep by minutes, etc. So the important part then is to assess, as you say, parental values and their ability to perform consistent sleep interventions, because some parents have a lot of resources available to them. Some parents work, there's other children in the household, etc. And so while the literature has demonstrated much success for controlled crying, or at least periods of crying it out, what behaviouralists call escape extinction, this can be brutal for some parents, and therefore they may give in and therefore reinforce longer periods of crying. So we have to look at very carefully about the parental unit in terms of, the intervention that we recommend. In such a young child as Stella, we might recommend establishing a positive bedtime routine, similar to what you've said, establishing clear antecedents and reinforcers for each of those behaviours that you set up for pre-bed behaviours, and then graduated extinction, which is using longer and longer periods of time to attend to the child, starting with immediately attending to the child and then extending that time by a very clear amount of minutes, and then analyse data as we go. This is a form of the Ferber method. It's more palatable than full extinction or full control crying, and it has been used successfully in multiple studies with rapid improvement in sleep onset, as little as 3 days in some studies, and rapid improvements in nighttime wakefulness.
Wow, okay. So the Ferber method is something that behavior analysts would use.
Yes, it is escape extinction, and it's just fading the the amount of time. And so, for instance, you might reinforce immediate crying on night 1, 2 minutes of crying on night 2, 3 minutes of crying, and it would be minimal social attention, but going back in and comforting the child, and then extending the period of time over which you do that. Now, I know you sort of have given some accounts with babies that would cry for long periods of time. In that type of intervention where you're in daily contact with parents, you would get to a point in time where you might say this is not working, and the parents cannot tolerate this amount of crying. That's why this is kind of a faded procedure. I have never had a case in the sleep interventions that I've done where the parents couldn't tolerate the amount of crying that resulted in the child being able to learn to go to sleep on its own. I'm sure there are cases of that, but I think I would have changed my intervention long before I got to long periods of crying and looked at those antecedent variables, parental attention, bedtime routines, etc., in a lot more detail before I would let babies cry for long, extended periods of time. So, so glad you said that. So glad.
because, I was about to push the pause button for OT because they're thinking, oh my gosh, you're going to have this preemie that we are postulating may have some lingering sensory issues, has difficulty self-calming, and you're just going to let her cry? That just seems wrong, right? But pause. Button for OTs. Comments like sensory overload, shutdown is what comes to mind for many OTs when we talk about this. But what you'll find, you meaning OTs out there, is that by taking some data and on what typical self-regulation is for Stella and also slicing it very thin, like Mandy mentioned, the interventions are very, very thin. We are staying away from that possible notion of sensory overload in the OT world. So again, communicating with the ABA therapist is going to be of paramount importance.
Yeah, and parent training, right? Because understanding, let's just say that the behaviour analyst has said, tonight, you're going to let her cry for 15 minutes before you attend to her. Understanding that, of course, as a parent, you have the right to do whatever you want, obviously, if it's as a parent, and you don't have to do what your advisor is telling you to do, but understanding the consequence of not following that. Because I have had, parents that I worked with where we were using escape extinction, say, for tantrums. And I always say to them, if you are going to reinforce a tantrum, the time to do it is now, not in 20 minutes' time, right? So if you say, and sometimes I have really parents, because we don't make it wrong when you can't follow through on an intervention, if you know that you have an appointment to get to or you have to get out the door, the time to reinforce a tantrum and give the child what they want is early in the chain of a tantrum, not when they've been crying for an hour. You know what I mean? So you can't always get it right. But understanding as a parent, go, okay, well, I understand that I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to go and attend to the child before the 15 minutes, which is what is in the written program. But I'm going to reinforce an earlier, approximation of the behaviour. So that's your right and your choice, but at least giving them training to understand the consequences of their interventions that they're using themselves, I think is empowering, and therefore, but also allows the behaviour analyst to look at the intervention and design it so that it can be successful for the parent.
No, definitely. Okay, so...
Yeah, just on that one issue of letting the baby cry it out, Aditi, I did just want to say that I think I've said it multiple times now because it's so important, is that we are not, or at least I'm not a medical doctor. I don't know if there are any BCBAs that are medical doctors. I'd love to hear from them. But I have this amazing paediatrician that I work with, and I just happen to have his mobile number. Going to give it out to anybody, but just saying he is the sort of paediatrician that is available, for regular consultation. That's a real asset to have, and that understands behaviour analysis and data. So having someone like that you can say, this is the procedure that we're going to, prescribe for this child. Do I have medical sign-off to, undertake this procedure? Is this something that you would support? And I did this just recently with a child that has self-injury in his repertoire. He injures because he has eczema. Sometimes he injures before he has eczema, and he goes to itch. And I wanted to bring in non-contingent itching on an hourly basis to reduce his desire to itch. And he loved it because I said we will take data on it. We will implement 3 minutes an hour. Then we will not provide attention or itching at any other time. And I was able to consult with him on the extent of the eczema, how much itch this would be causing, and then take data and show him the impact on the reduction in self-injury associated with it. So having a really good medical doctor that can give you that comfort that, you're not going to push a baby to that position that you talk about there of sensory overload or shutdown. Right. From a shutdown, from my perspective, that's a harsh word of saying that this baby was not medically resilient enough to cope with the intervention. So I think this is why I keep putting in this, message about full medical history, medical advice before proceeding, particularly when you have significant behavioural challenges involved, and ensuring that you have experts that have experience that you're consulting with in this field before you do an implementation with a premature baby, for instance. So I think we've said it before, but we have included a copy of Greg Hanley's assessment and the OT perspective that assessment tool that you mentioned, Aditi, and Also, I have included a study by James Lewiselli, who summarised all of the behavioural assessment, measurement and intervention procedures. It's a really good paper if you're going to jump to look at it. So I've included that paper in our reference materials.
Brilliant. I also included an OT article published in 2018, so very recent, on the OT practice and sleep management, sort of a review on all the models and research. It's a brilliant resource too. So I think we've got it all covered. Lots of great resources.
Yep.
Next week, we're going to keep on the topic of sleep, but we're expanding to a wider audience of typically developing children because everyone seems to have sleep issues. And we're going to review the use of Patrick Fryman's Bedtime Pass.
Woo!
I'm so excited about this one. A really well-known intervention, like Mandy said, and it's looking at establishing bedtime routines. And we're also going to discuss the literature on screen time, blue light, all that, and its impact on sleep. So whether you have children of your own or have clients you can help, this is going to be an episode you don't want to miss for sure.
Great. Didi, well, that brings us to a conclusion. The takeaways from today is establishing clear sleep routines, avoiding interruptions, 2 known precursors to falling asleep. Probably important documentation on interventions to improve sleep, which we're going to be sharing with you. Looking at avoiding bright lights, access to caffeine through, for instance, Coke and Pepsi, etc., important in the lead up to sleep. Looking at how daytime sleep impacts as well, and other really good ideas, Aditi, for analysing a child's day to ensure that they are not aroused at sleep time and have adequate access to exercise and other things that would evoke sleep at night, avoiding things like late time meals, etc. And then sharing with you the latest research on sleep literature, sleep questionnaires, which will be available for download in our Facebook group. So that's lots of takeaways for today.
Yes, indeed. I think I want to take a sleep now. I'm ready to take a nap for sure.
Great.
Thanks to all of you who have reached out to us. OT's ABA psychologist was also a new person, and also most recently SLPs. Yay, our team is growing. Collaborators are definitely welcome. And by the way, we also have a YouTube channel now. Remember, our most valuable resource is each other. So without collaboration, our growth is limited to our own perspectives. So #collaboration over competition. Until next time, bye-bye from the Windy City.
And hooroo from down under.